Jan is also very good. I would like to use the opportunity and to thank Mats and Alberto and all of the team. Yeah, so thanks. Please do on behalf of the steering committee of this conference. So we have Janneke over there representing the CS Games development application part, and myself for the international conference on CS Games Game Days, and we merged in 2015, and this implies that we now have eighth edition of this conference, so we are really happy about it. Okay, but that's it for the introductory words, and I welcome two speakers now. You're doing this together, Jamie Ferguson and Daisy Abbott. Okay, and Sandy Louchart is not here. Yeah. Okay, good. And I'm really excited how it works. A model for mapping serious game mechanics to pedagogical patterns. So we are working on the other way around, how to use pedagogical patterns in games and game design, but I'm excited how you explain the way around.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks, Stefan. My name is Jamie, this is Daisy, and we're from the School of Innovation and Technology at the Glasgow School of Art, and we're going to talk about our paper, A Model for Mapping Serious Game Mechanics to Pedagogical Patterns. So, firstly, to give you a bit of context about this research, so we're a small part of a much larger research project called Cetrius, which is funded by the EPSRC in the UK. And it's a combination of cybersecurity researchers, game design researchers, and also educators as well. We mostly make up the game design and educators part, but we also work with Heriot-Watt University, who are more on the cybersecurity side, and the University of St Andrews, who are doing some anthropological research on the project as a whole. So, like I said, we're a small part of this larger project, of which we've kind of taken part in lots of different activities. The kind of primary and most important one is a series of game jams, which is where we kind of gather the data that we're going to talk about today. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that this is a very small part. There's lots of other parts of this research. If you're interested, there'll be a link at the end to look at all the other stuff as well. So, like I said, we're part of this project that's got kind of three components together: cybersecurity, games, and education. But broadly, when you're designing any kind of serious game, you're going to have this group of three. You're going to have your domain application, whatever it might be. You're going to have games design, and you're going to have education or learning design. And in any serious game design, you're rarely going to have team members that fit all three of these criteria, that fit right in the middle of that Venn diagram. Sometimes you've got people that have two, but I think it's fair to say that most often you're going to have individuals who are experts in one area. And it's a priority to have effective communication between all of these groups. I think that's something that's well documented in the serious games literature, and that's definitely something we've experienced throughout this project, is effectively being able to make cybersecurity experts understand the priorities of a game designer and vice versa, and the same with education, is something that's quite difficult, and especially if you don't have the base knowledge to be able to kind of have a shared language between each other. And that's kind of the motivation for this research that we're talking about. So, firstly, some definitions. So, what are pedagogical patterns? So, pedagogical patterns are a way of capturing and disseminating knowledge in the form of a reusable solution. And we also talked a bit about learning and gaming mechanics, which here we've used in a card form, which are essentially, I think we all know what gaming mechanics are, things like movement. And learning mechanics are a similar thing, but for pedagogy. So, for example, analysis. And again, we've chosen to use these kind of resources to go back to this idea of a trifecta between education, game design, and the domain, which for us is security. So, what we used in this study, we, as I said, use pedagogical patterns, learning game mechanics, and we also use the triadic game design approach, which I think a lot of you will probably be quite familiar with. We also used serious game mechanics, which are the combination of LM and GM. So where we built on from here is serious game mechanics provides a lot of the groundwork for this communication between the three groups. However, they aren't expressed as reusable patterns, therefore aren't necessarily very useful to those outside of the game design sphere who might not be familiar with what game mechanics are, what learning mechanics are, for example. So we wanted to try and find a way to make it more readable and more reusable for people outside of the sphere to facilitate communication between all the different groups. And what are we hoping to find? So we're hoping to find if any patterns emerge for cybersecurity education, and can we devise a method for reliably deriving reusable patterns from game design documentation? And I'm going to hand it over to Daisy.
Okay, so what we did is we got the data set from our series of game jams, which was 12 different documented games, each of which took around 5 days from start to finish to design. They were all co-designed with teams which ranged from 11-year-old kids to master's students, and the game designers, the co-designers on the game jams were supported by cybersecurity experts on our team, game design experts, and also to a slightly lesser extent pedagogy experts. So we gathered up all of this documentation. We had gameplay loops, we had the card set that Jamie showed just there. They had used the cards to kind of identify what techniques they were using. And we took this set of 12 games, all of which had a cybersecurity theme, and kind of analysed them, mapped them into serious game mechanics, and then tried to analyse those serious game mechanics. So this is how the serious game mechanics that we identified map to pedagogical patterns. Now, I expect most people here may not have read the literature on pedagogical patterns, so these labels at the bottom might be a little bit meaningless. So I'm going to say that our paper kind of sits alongside the pedagogical pattern research. So if you're interested in this, please read the other paper as well. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of these. We can see there we've got 4 that were 100%. The first 3, sorry, the number 1, 2 and 4 there, active student, repeat yourself and war game. Those are ones that we considered you can't be a game without using that pedagogical pattern. So they just kind of appeared by default. And of course, to nobody's surprise, feedback appeared in 100% of the games that we designed. Just a couple of the other high featuring ones then. We've got this idea of early warning. Now that's the name of a pedagogical pattern, which means that when somebody's going wrong, you give them an early warning. And of course it's highly linked to feedback. It's a useful learning technique to find out as soon as you can when you're going wrong. And we can see, you can almost guess from some of the names of these pedagogical patterns, like digestible packets. As an educator, you give your students chunked learning. You make things easier to learn by scaffolding learning. So you can already start to see the kind of game mechanics that might be associated with these pedagogical patterns. And everything up to spiral there has a frequency of more than 70% in the 12 games that we analysed. This is our very hard to read mapping of serious game mechanics and pedagogical patterns. So as an overview of this, in the middle we have serious game mechanics. So a serious game mechanic is a learning mechanic which is associated with a game mechanic. So the learning mechanics are blue, the game mechanics are in yellow here. And everything that didn't appear in more than a quarter of the games has been excluded from this diagram because it would just be a complete mess if we tried to include everything. So these are the sort of top three quarters of the serious game mechanics. The bounding boxes in the diagram give you a sense of how complex the interrelations are in different serious game mechanics. So we have here incentive, for instance, the second one down. It only ever was mapped to competition as a game mechanic. Now I'm sure we can all think of lots of other ways that incentives could be mapped to game mechanics, but in our data set it was a one-to-one mapping with competition. Something like analysis, though, down the bottom, you can see it's much, much more complex. The white nodes on the outside show the pedagogical patterns as defined in the literature that we believe that serious game mechanic maps to. And the ones on the left are where we think it's more influenced by the learning mechanic, the blue column, and the ones on the right is where we think it's more influenced by the game mechanics. Okay, so we know it's hard to read this. We had plans to make a sort of dynamic version of this diagram so you could hover over things and it would be much easier to read. That's very much a work in progress. So let's just look at one example here. So if we take the idea of repetition, this is a learning mechanic, to repeat something to really remember it and understand it. It was mapped here to 3 different game mechanics. Game turns, obviously there's repetition there. The idea of behavioural momentum, you start somebody on an easy task that they can do, you create a kind of behavioural momentum. This is like the tutorial levels that you see in many games. And then this idea of cascading information. So you start people with small chunks of information and then again you build on that through repetition. And it maps here to a pedagogical pattern called round robin. So that's just one example to give you a sense of the relationships between these different elements. So there was one finding in particular that we wanted to focus on as being quite interesting, which is that we had much more than we expected serious game mechanics that applied at the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So remember here, that's the kind of surface learning. I can just repeat some facts back to you. And as you go up the pyramid there, you get these higher order learning outcomes. And what we found is that most of our serious game mechanics were actually in these lower levels. We were quite surprised by this because our focus was on cybersecurity behavioural practices. And we did get some players who were relating their game designs to real-world applications, but they were the master students who were about to enter the world of work. The kids, the school kids, were very much in this didactic, well, it's about quizzes and a teacher tells me something and then I repeat it back on a test. So we were quite surprised by that, and that's our interpretation of why that happened. We really feel that in terms of cybersecurity games, we'd be better served by looking at serious game mechanics that come towards the top, the apply upwards levels of Bloom's taxonomy, because these kind of learning mechanics are better at producing behavioural change, not just cognitive growth. Yeah. So that was a surprise. This mapping is, as I said, it's only based on 12 games. The games were designed by people who were definitely novices in at least one, if not all 3 of those overlapping areas that we talked about. So the data set is absolutely not definitive, it is simply based on our case study. And we feel that the process is a much more, the much more valuable part of this work is actually the process. So we came up with this diagram. It represents our data. It's not to be used for all serious games design. However, if you made a subject-specific version for your subject, whatever that may be, you could curate in a similar kind of fashion a similar sort of mapping, which would assist this communication that we talked about between the 3 different areas of expertise that you need to have involved in serious games design. So our suggestion here is that if you're an educator, you might say, well, I use a round robin approach. I go around my class and I ask questions. So you would start with round robin up there at the top right, and you'd look inwards and say, aha, right, let's look at some of the serious game mechanics that are likely to work for me in my context. Conversely, if you're a serious games designer or a games designer, you might start with the game mechanics and then use the pedagogical patterns to validate, is your approach likely to achieve the learning outcomes that you're going for? So we feel that this process kind of, it definitely facilitates the terminology and the communication between different expertise, and you can, to some extent, use it to validate certain approaches before you've spent too much money on your game. Okay, so just to wrap up then, we're proposing that mapping serious game mechanics, which are themselves a mapping between a learning mechanic and a game mechanic, so mapping those overall dyads, the serious game mechanics, to pedagogical patterns, it can produce helpful resources for knowledge exchange and communication between educators and game designers. And the process of coming up with these mappings is a very useful one in terms of understanding how it actually is that your games are delivering the learning outcomes that you hope they are. So yeah, just to reiterate, our data is not definitive, the process is the more valuable part of this research, and almost perfectly on time. I just want to say the project is wrapping up right now. You can get absolutely everything we produced on this project from the card decks. There's a cybersecurity card deck as well. There's a lot of workflows for designing serious games. There's a lot of information about the game jams that we ran, and you can get it all for free on this website. There's also, of course, a few games about cybersecurity as well. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot to Daisy and
Jenny.
Okay, are there any questions? Maybe Jannika was the first.
Thanks a lot for the interesting presentation. As you said, your project is now closing. How do you intend to take this research further? Because it was one single one, and we have the challenge with these LMGM questions that they're always very specific for some sets of games.
Yeah, do you mean at the moment they're specific for one set of games?
How do you take it further so that we perhaps achieve something which is more applicable for a lot of aspects or games?
Well, it's an interesting question. So I don't think there's any one model that would be applicable across the board. This is why our proposal would be that people who are working in particular subject areas would they'd sort of curate their own suite of serious game mapping to pedagogical patterns. What I'm going to work on after this, Jamie might not even know this, most of my focus is in games for research skills, so I'm going to use the same process as we did here, but focusing on games which aim to teach academic and research skills, so I'll make that available when that's ready, but I really think that a subject-based approach will be the most practical way to use this work. I'm not convinced there will be ever any kind of worldwide answer to serious game design.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay.
Looking forward to your next article then.
Thank you.
Okay, Jan?
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering,